For 3 months, I dated a woman named Mara. We had inside jokes. We argued about which way the toilet paper should hang. I met her at a bookstore, in broad daylight, surrounded by people. And exactly none of that stopped me from finding out, in the most quietly horrifying way possible, that Mara had been dead for 11 years before I ever touched her hand. I'm not telling you this story to scare you. I'm telling you this story because what actually happened to me has a real, documented explanation rooted in psychology, one that researchers have been studying for decades, and one that might apply to people you know right now without either of you realizing it. Here's the part that should unsettle you the most. I have photos of us together. Dozens of them. And when I show them to other people, exactly half of them see 2 people in the picture. The other half see 1. Stick with me, because the answer to why isn't supernatural at all. It's something your brain is fully capable of doing to you. Right now, today, and by the end of this video, you'll never fully trust your own memory the same way again. I met Mara on a Tuesday in October, at a second-hand bookstore on the edge of town, the kind of place with creaky floors and a cat that technically isn't supposed to be there. She was holding a copy of a novel I'd read twice, and she made a joke about the ending that was genuinely funnier than anything I'd thought of myself. We talked for 40 minutes. I got her number written on a receipt because, of course, she didn't have a phone on her, left it charging. She said, for the next 3 months. That became a pattern. She never called me first. She texted from numbers that changed twice, explained away as phone problems. She'd appear at places we'd agreed to meet, but I could never quite remember her actually arriving. She was just suddenly there, like I'd looked away for a second too long. I noticed it. I just didn't notice it. If that makes sense, the way you don't notice your own blind spot until something forces you to. Here's a fact that's going to matter a lot in a few minutes, according to research on a real, documented psychiatric phenomenon called Capgras adjacent confabulation and related memory construction disorders. The human brain is fully capable of generating detailed, emotionally rich, multisensory memories of events and people that never existed in the way we remember them, not through lying, but through a process neuroscientists call memory confabulation, first rigorously documented in the 1990s by researchers studying patients with frontal lobe damage. I didn't have frontal lobe damage. I want to be clear about that. What I had was something else entirely, and it took my sister noticing something in a photograph to even start unraveling it. 3 months in, I sent my sister a picture from a weekend trip, me and Mara at a lookout point, the kind of overly staged couple photo you take specifically to post online. My sister called me 40 minutes later. Not texted, called. Who took this picture? She asked. I told her Mara had set up the timer on the rock behind us. There's no one else in this photo. She said, it's just you. I laughed it off. Bad angle, I said. Camera glitch. But that night, I went back through every photo I had of the 2 of us, 11, total across 3 months. In 6 of them, Mara was clearly visible, smiling, her hand on my shoulder, exactly as I remembered it happening. In the other 5, there was just me, standing the same way, posed the same way, arm slightly bent, like it was resting on someone's shoulder, just nobody there. I want you to sit in that feeling for a second, because I sat in it for 3 days straight. Not the fear of ghosts, the fear of not being able to trust the most basic input your own eyes give you. So I did the only thing that made sense. I went back to the bookstore. The owner, same guy, same cat, looked at me like I'd asked him something in another language when I described Mara. Then he checked his employee records because she'd mentioned working there part-time once. In passing, there was no Mara on payroll. There never had been, but there was a name in his old guest book from a memorial event held in that same store 11 years earlier, a regular customer who died in a car accident at 26. Same first name, same description, down to the specific way she apparently always held books against her chest with both arms. I'm going to pause the story right there, because the explanation for what happened to me next is the part most people get completely wrong. This wasn't a haunting. I want to take the ghost framing off the table entirely, because what was actually happening to me is, in some ways, more unsettling than a ghost would be, and it's backed by real clinical research. Grief researchers, including work published through the American Psychological Association, have documented something called continuing bonds, a well-established pattern where people who've experienced significant loss construct ongoing, vivid relationships with the deceased, sometimes without consciously recognizing that the relationship is being internally generated rather than externally real. In rare, more extreme cases, this can escalate into what's clinically described as grief-related hallucination, auditory or visual experiences of a deceased person that feel completely indistinguishable from physical reality. Reported by a surprisingly high number of bereaved individuals, a widely cited study out of the UK found that more than half of widowed people report some form of sensory experience of their deceased spouse hearing their voice, feeling their presence, in some cases, seeing them clearly enough to hold a conversation. Here's the twist I didn't see coming, and the reason this story isn't actually about Mara at all. I didn't know her. I had never met her when she was alive, which meant the bookstore employee's records, his memorial guest book, the 11-year-old obituary, I eventually found none of that explained why I had constructed an entire 3-month relationship with her. Until my sister asked me one more question. What were you doing right before October? I'd lost my fiancé in a car accident the previous March. Different woman, different name. I had never once let myself process it. I'd gone back to work 9 days later. I told everyone I was handling it fine. And 7 months after that, somehow, in a bookstore on a Tuesday, my brain had reached into a memorial guest book it had glanced at without registering, pulled a name and a face and a personality that fit the shape of the hole I refused to look at, and built me someone to love instead of grieving the person I'd actually lost. Here's why I'm telling you all of this, and it has nothing to do with whether you believe in ghosts. The half of people who look at my photos and see two people, they're not lying, and they're not gullible. Confirmation bias and suggestion are powerful enough that once you tell someone there's a woman in this photo, their brain will often find her, filling in a blurred rock formation or a shadow with just enough detail to feel certain. That's not a flaw in those people. That's a basic, well-documented feature of human perception that's been replicated in eyewitness testimony research for over 40 years. But the other half, the ones who looked and immediately said there's no one there, they were looking at the exact same unedited photograph I was. Looking at every single day for 3 months. Fully convinced I could see someone they couldn't. That gap is the real horror of this story. Not a ghost in a bookstore. The fact that your own mind, under enough unprocessed grief, can build a fully detailed person, a voice, a laugh, a specific way of holding books against her chest and hand her to you so convincingly that you'd swear in front of anyone that she was real, while quietly protecting you from a loss you weren't ready to face. I started grief therapy 4 weeks after that phone call with my sister. I'm not going to tell you it fixed everything overnight, because that would be exactly the kind of clean, false ending this story doesn't deserve. Some days I still reach for my phone to text a number that was never real. But I finally know, clearly, who I'm actually grieving, and that's the first real step anyone in this position can take. So if you came here for a ghost story, here's the answer: yes. I dated a ghost for 3 months. But the haunting wasn't supernatural. It was unprocessed grief wearing a borrowed name, built by my own brain to spare me from a pain I wasn't ready to carry. If any part of this made you think about someone you've lost, someone you maybe told everyone you were handling fine, that feeling you just had is worth paying attention to. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes it looks like a stranger in a bookstore who happens to fit perfectly into the shape of everything you lost. If this story affected you, drop a comment. I read every one. And I'm genuinely curious how many of you have experienced something like this, without ever putting a name to it. And if you want to hear what happened when I finally visited the real grave, hers, not Mara's, that video's coming next. You're not going to want to miss it.